Hi and welcome. In our previous tutorial, we learned what the factory pattern is, and we learned about the bean factory of Spring. In this tutorial, we're going to go hands-on. We're going to write code which uses the bean factory to instantiate the objects that we want. So first, let me start off with writing a class with a main method that kicks off the execution of our application. So I will create a package and a main class. I'll call this the drawing application and I need a main method. In this drawing application, I will be drawing some shapes. So first let me create a triangle shape, create a new class, call this triangle. I don't need a main method for this one. This triangle, very simple as of now, we'll just have a public void draw. Okay, it just prints out that a triangle has been drawn. Save this. Now in my drawing application, first what I'll do is I'll not use the bean factory. I'll just say triangle equals new triangle. I'm going to use the new and I will instantiate it just as if I would use it without using Spring. So if I say triangle dot draw, it's going to print that statement which draws the triangle. There you go. It draws a triangle. But here we are not using Spring. So let's use Spring now. In order to use Spring, I will comment this out. See, now we will not be using a new command here. We are not going to instantiate the triangle object ourselves. We'll ask the bean factory to do it. So let me instantiate the bean factory first. I'll say bean factory equals new. Okay, I need to provide an implementation of the bean factory. There are different bean factory classes available. The bean factory is the interface and there are different implementation classes. I will use the XML bean factory. And the use of the XML bean factory is that it'll configure the bean factory using an XML file. Earlier I told you that the bean factory reads the blueprints of the beans from a configuration file. I plan to use an XML file in this example to provide the configuration to Spring. So in order to read that XML file, the bean factory has to be an XML bean factory. So the XML bean factory reads an XML file. So I'll create an instance of the XML bean factory. So there are different types of bean factories depending on how you specify the configuration. You can use the corresponding bean factory. Since I happen to be using an XML file in this tutorial, I will use the XML bean factory here. So the XML bean factory takes in an argument which is the actual resource where I have my XML. So I'll create a new file system resource, and this file system resource will be, let me call it spring.xml. I have to do the imports here. I will import XML bean factory from org.springframework.beans.factory.xml. So this is the class that I'll be importing, and the file system resource is again a Spring object. It's Spring Framework core.io, and the bean factory is from Spring Framework's bean factory. Okay, I have all the imports in place. Now I have my bean factory here. Now this bean factory reads from an XML file. We need to provide this XML file. So let me just go here and right click, create new XML file. We'll say other. Scroll all the way down till you see this XML node here, and I'll create a new XML file. Press next. We'll call this spring.xml, since this is the name that I've given there. And I'll say finish. Okay, and we go to the source. This is a blank XML file. Now in this XML, I need to provide the blueprint for the bean that I need to instantiate from the storing app. So I need to tell Spring saying, hey, I need a triangle object and it has to be instantiated. So here what I'm going to do is first I need to have the doc type line here. In order to get the doc type line, what you can do is head over to the Spring jars that you've downloaded. Here you have a projects folder. So inside this projects folder, you can search for this XML. I will search for application context.xml. Here you get a lot of sample XMLs that we can use. I'm just going to pick one, and I'm going to copy this doc type line. In fact, let me copy these two. Okay, so now I have the doc type here, so we know that this is a Spring XML. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define all the beans that we want. I'll have a beans node, and inside this beans node I can define as many number of beans as I want. I just want one bean in this case, which is a triangle. So I'll say bean ID equals triangle. I need to give an ID for my bean, and let me come to the reason why in a minute. So the other thing that I need to provide is a class. Class equals org.kaushik.javabrains.triangle. Typo here. Okay, so this is all it takes. So now what have I provided here? I have provided two values. One is the ID of the bean and the other is the class of the bean. The class of the bean we have to provide, it's obvious because the Spring Factory needs to know which class it needs to instantiate the object from. But what is this ID here? The ID is the reference to this particular bean. Every bean will have an ID. So what's going to happen is now when I save this, in my application, in any class in this Spring application, I can instantiate a new bean factory and say, hey bean factory, give me the bean triangle. And then what the bean factory is going to do is it's going to go to the Spring XML and it's going to look for a bean definition with the ID triangle, and it's going to instantiate the corresponding class. So what's going to happen here is now I need to say bean factory, get me the bean triangle. So what I need to do is I need to say factory dot, there is a method called getBean, and then this takes a string argument in which I pass the ID of the bean that I have configured here. So I can have any number of beans over here. So depending on the ID, I can tell the factory what exactly is the bean that it needs to get. So now this factory, factory.getBean is going to get me the object. So I need to have an instance which will catch this object. So I'll say triangle equals. Now since it's an object, I need to cast it. So the object that the factory.getBean is retrieving for me is cast into a triangle object, and then I assign it to my local triangle variable. And then now I do a triangle.draw for this local variable. So note that I'm not doing a new triangle. That's what I did earlier. Now I'm not doing that. Now what I'm doing is I'm asking the bean factory to get me a bean. So since this is a object that's created by Spring, this will be inside the Spring container. But I have a reference to this object which is inside the Spring container, and I'm calling a method of that object. So let's run this and see how this works. There you go, you get a triangle drawn message. So it's run the draw method of this object that's inside the Spring container. Now you might be wondering, why are we doing all this? Instead of using just one line of code, why are we performing this circus act of getting this object from Spring? Now the advantage is not obvious in this case because triangle is a very simple class. It really has nothing except for this method. But the point here is that what I'm providing here is a blueprint for the object. So the more complex the object becomes, the more detailed the blueprint becomes, and the more advantage you see in this whole method of getting the object from Spring. So you can have a very complicated object and you can instantiate the object completely just by defining the whole thing inside the Spring.xml. And once you define it in one place, it can be instantiated in as many classes as you want. And then when you make a call, the object that you get is going to be perfectly as per your specification depending on what you have defined in this Spring.xml. So again, since it's a very simple class, the advantage is not obvious, but you will see how this helps in the subsequent tutorials.